I was with Miles Van Pelt last week. He's the author, along with Gary Pratico, The Basics of Biblical Hebrew. And we were talking about a really interesting topic, and that is how hard do we push first year language students? Now, normally what happens in first year is that the students need to let the teacher know that they know it's a participle or an indicative verb, that they know whether it's a present participle or an aorist participle. And so we say, like, while eating or after sleeping. And we have these mechanisms so that the student can show the teacher they know what the Greek says or the Hebrew says. The problem is, unless you think Yoda actually speaks English, that's not good translation, is it? I mean, it's awkward and difficult. And Miles and I were talking about how maybe what we should be doing is encouraging our students to do, yes, that word for word kind of awkward translation, but then actually do a second translation that's real English. I mean, one of the problems that I see students coming out of school is they're so used to doing these word for word translations that they think that means it's accurate. And I don't think it does. I think it's just bad English. English is different from Greek. And what we need to do in translation is learn to say, with faithfully but with readable English, this is what the text says. This is what the text means, right? So one of the questions was, well, when does this start? Is this a third year thing or a second year thing? And we said, no, it's really a first year thing. We want our first year Greek and Hebrew students to understand that, yes, initially you have to do that awkward word for word stilted translation so your teacher knows you know what you're doing. But really, from the day one, what students should also be doing is then a real English translation, something that understands English style and is smooth and it moves properly. I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations, but they're built on this whole issue of sequence, and I need to say something briefly about it. And this is just as an illustration of the main point I'm making. In Greek, well, I should say in English, if you say A, B, we hear sequence. We hear that A happened, then B happened. Greek doesn't. And what Greek has to do is find a way to explicitly state this happened, then this happened. And the standard way of doing that is to have an aorist adverbial participle followed by an indicative verb. And it's very, very common. And so the question in translation is, well, in proper English, do you translate the participle as a participle and the indicative as an indicative? Because if you do, it's just really bad English. It's poor English. And what I would like to see, and Miles would like to see, is students start doing the word for word and then smooth English. Let me give you a couple of illustrations, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. The first is in Matthew 2, verse 16. And this is how we would tend to translate it in first year Greek. Then Herod, after seeing, this is your aorist participle, that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became really angry. He got ticked off. And after sending, understood the soldiers, there is no direct object there, he killed all the baby boys. And see, for the two participles, after seeing and after sending, again, that's how we do it traditionally in first year Greek. But it's not English, is it? How would we say that in English? We'd say, well, Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi and became angry, and probably period. And he sent, understood the soldiers, and killed all the baby children, all the baby boys. See, I had to do a couple of things. I had to change a long sentence into a shorter sentence and supply a couple of words. And I changed the participles to indicative verbs, but why? Because that's how you do it in English. And so the question is, should we be doing that in first year Greek? And I really think that we should. Let me give you another illustration. It's a little more complicated, and I'm going to show you a screenshot in just a second. But it's Mark 2, Mark 12:28. It's the greatest commandment. And word for word, in traditional beginning Greek style, Jesus, or the text says, And after coming, one of the scribes, after hearing those disputing, after seeing that he had answered them well, he asked him, what's the greatest commandment? Well, that's not English, all right? You're showing that you know there are 3 aorist adverbial participles, but is that enough for first year Greek? Well, I would like to see more. Now let me hop on over to my iPad here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And I'm going to start by phrasing this just to break it into its different categories. And you always set aside that initial conjunction. Okay, there's your first participle after arriving. Then your subject of the sentence, one of the scribes. And then another aorist participle after hearing those who were debating. After seeing that he answered them well, let me get that in there properly. He asked him what? Well, what is the first commandment of all? When you look at this, what you realize is here is the subject, here's the verb, and here's its direct object, right? Everything else is modifying. You have after arriving, after hearing, and after seeing. Now, if we could go back and to do a little phrasing, I'm going to indent this just because I want to get it over the verb. So I'm going to indent that one, I'm going to indent that one, and I'm going to indent that one. And I like to indent initial conjunctions because when you get a whole series of verses going, it'll makes it really clear that these are the conjunctions holding the verses together. The other thing that I need to do here, though, is I'm starting to use arrows more in phrasing. Just when there's intervening information, I need to indicate the connection. So the connection is that we have here one of the scribes, he came, he heard, he saw, and then he asked. So what's the right way to translate this in Greek? Well, again, in traditional first year, we would all put afters in front of those participles. After coming, after hearing, after seeing, he asked. And of course, the part of the problem with that is in relative time, aorist participles indicate an action that occurred prior to the time of the main verb. The main verb is an aorist, and so technically, you're going to have to put the time of the participles before the time of the aorist verb. Well, after having, you get some bizarre, awkward translation. After having come and after having heard and after having seen, he asked. Okay, we're even moving further and further away from English. So what I'd like to propose is 2 things. One is we don't let our students end with that kind of translation. 2 is to understand the nature of English style, understand how English hears sequence, and you can translate this, and one of the scribes came and heard those debating. And I changed participles to indicatives, but that's what we do in English. And probably put a period there, and then start a new sentence. He saw that he had answered well and asked him. Okay, that makes perfectly good sense. It keeps the relative time. It keeps the sequence of thought. And I like to propose that's a perfectly good way to translate. But the main issue here that I just wanted to raise, and that is, what do we ask of our students? And what do students ask of themselves? And please, more and more I'm thinking, do your wooden, awkward, non-English translation meant to let your teacher know that you know what it is. But then the student should actually use English and translate in a way that they would translate if they were on a translating committee. Okay? Something to think about.